It's kind of crazy to think that as recently as 40 years ago, if you wanted to make beer in your home, you'd have to break the law. Thankfully, in 1978, it became legal on the federal level for people to homebrew, but unfortunately, this didn't include everyone, as certain states continued to restrict this natural right. But this all ended in 2013 when the last two holdouts, Mississippi and Alabama, passed laws making it okay for people to make beer at home. For the first time since Prohibition, it was legal to homebrew in all 50 of the United States. This was due in large part to the dedication and hard work of the American Homebrewers Association. In addition to continuing the fight for our right to brew, they're committed to growing the hobby by coordinating events such as Big Brew for National Homebrew Day and HomebrewCon. We're proud to say that the Brewlosophy podcast is brought to you by the American Homebrewers Association and encourage all of our listeners to support the organization that has done so much for this hobby by becoming a member today. There are very few things I'm absolutely certain about, but one is that beer is the most delicious beverage on earth, not only providing its consumers with endless combinations of malty, hoppy, and yeasty goodness, but a pretty pleasant feeling to go along with it. Well, as wonderful as beer is, not every example is perfect. There are certain characteristics every brewer works to avoid, one of which is characterized by an odd experience on the tongue that some liken to sucking on a tea bag. This is the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott. And on this episode, contributor Ray Found and I will be focusing on this commonly cited off flavor.
Sometimes called a flavor, but often referred to more of a mouthfeel, actually, is astringency, the flavor commonly associated with tannins.
Yeah, right. I know there are a few, I believe that astringency is kind of the term used to describe this group of really what really is kind of an experience on the tongue or in your mouth, something like that. I know for a fact that I've noted astringency in beers that I've judged, and I've also been told that beers I brewed had this mouth puckering off flavor. And with these comments, as I'm sure you've experienced as well, Ray, often comes presumptuous kind of, advice on what to do to fix this problem. You ever experienced anything like that?
I have experienced effects from things that are commonly associated with astringency. However, I would be fairly hesitant to ever classify something I've really personally tasted as being astringent in the very strict sense of the word. Maybe hints of that, but never something where I'd say, "Oh, that's astringent." And I don't know if that would make me a bad beer judge.
Or a really good one. I mean, I feel like, in the top 5 most commonly cited off flavors, you got DMS, diacetyl, acetaldehyde, and then somewhere up in those last 2 is astringency. I mean, I've been seeing it more and more lately on score sheets that get shared with me. And like you, I've had my fair share of red wine and I like tea a lot. But I do think that it's an easily mistaken off. I'm going to call it an off character because it really isn't a flavor.
Yeah, I know I've had one or two beers that were at the time. It was hard for me to suss out the difference between like phenols from what I perceive to be like an infection,
right,
and the harshness and the unpleasant characteristic of that versus what is actually astringency that we talk about as being that tannic, like you say, the teabag type flavor. Or mouthfeel, right? Yeah, really hard to kind of suss out. I mean, for me at least, where the line is between that's phenolic and harsh and tastes like acetone, but is it astringent? I'm not sure.
No, I'm with you on that. When I was studying for the BJCP exam, and which really just amounted to reading how to brew again. There's a lot of talk online and whatnot about this confusion between bitterness and astringency, and I can understand how the two might go together. We're going to be going over all of that stuff along with some other really interesting things, such as some experiment results a little bit later in the show. I want to thank everybody again who's been using our links when they're doing their shopping online. It's been helping us out a ton. If you're looking for a painless way to help us to continue bringing you this show, you can use those links as well. They're over at brewlosophy.com/support. If you want to be rewarded for your support, you can become a patron of Brewlosophy. Super cool way for you to pledge a little bit of support by contributing a small monthly amount of money to us. In return, you're going to receive things like access to the Brew Crew private forum, never before published recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A with a special guest. Coming up later in this month, our friends from Imperial Yeast are going to be joining us, answering questions from patrons for about an hour about our favorite fermentative critter, along with other stuff that people might ask them. Really good folks who are super smart, particularly, I'm sure, over numerous things, but when it comes to yeast and whatnot. Later on in the year, we've got some other rad guests, including Russian Rivers, Vinny Chilurzo, Seth Clan from Mecca Great Estate Malt, New England IPA expert and Ales of the Riverwards blogger Ed Coffey. And one of the ones I'm super excited for is the Pope of Foam himself, Dr. Charlie Bamforth from the UC Davis Brewing Program. To learn more about how you can be rewarded for helping us to continue bringing you this content, you can head over to patreon.com/brewlosophy. All right, just a couple of weeks until HomebrewCon, and we've still got a few spots left on the early bird guest list for our annual karaoke party. Actually, there's only some more spots left because I called them up and reserved a bigger room because the response has been so good. If you're headed to Portland for the conference and you don't want to miss a hell of a time doing crazy things with crazy people, shoot me an email, marshall@brewlosophy.com, and I'll get you details on making a donation to get your name on the guest list. We're also going to be in town early to set things up at our booth. And so then after we're done doing that evening on the 27th, we're going to be heading out to Imperial Bottle Shop on Division Street. That's Wednesday night around 6 p.m. For Imperial Yeast's Insane in the Yeast Strain event. I wanted to clarify something. I think when they first planned this, they were planning on having 12 different beers, all made from the same wort, but fermented with 12 of their yeast strains. I recently heard that it's going to be 8 different beers. So not a huge difference. Still going to be a kick-ass time. Come on out and drink with us if you're in the area on June 27th. Again, that's 6 p.m. at Imperial Bottle Shop in Portland. Speaking of Imperial Yeast, they're the sponsor of this week's feedback, and we love them for it. If you haven't tried their stuff yet, get on it. Imperial is providing brewers with the finest quality yeast on the market, packing 200 billion cells into each pitch-right pouch. Brewers are ensured a quick and healthy fermentation with a wide range of ale and lager strains available. You're sure to find what you need to turn your wort into delicious beer. In fact, I just kegged a beer fermented with B45 Gnome. I don't make many Belgian beers, but I'm telling you, this one's got me pretty excited to drink it. Little low alcohol-ish Belgian blonde ale. The beer is super clear, really tasty. Go check out everything Imperial Yeast has to offer at imperialyeast.com. You will not regret it. Well, it's become pretty common for me to get emails from people asking about certain issues they're having in the process. Ray, I'm sure you've got some thoughts on this. I think just because the fact that we have like a website and a podcast, people seem to think we're like experts on this stuff, but really we're just homebrewers doing the same things they are. We might read a little bit more often than they do by nature of the fact that we're researching the variables that we experiment with. But if I have time, I try to help them out, But a couple weeks ago, I got this long email from a dude called Robert Stutzman, who lives in Southern California. He, I think I'll just read his email. It's pretty long, so bear with me. What's up, bro? I have a problem that I've not been able to solve. I have 10 all-grain batches under my belt, and only a few have turned out decent. Coincidentally, those have been the ones that I decided to hold off on the pre-celebration drinks until I was done. I thought I had it figured out. Don't start drinking an IPA when you're heating up the mash water. Unfortunately, while that did solve the problems of boilovers, poor hop timing, my constant urge to yell out to my wife and kids, "It's science!" and constantly forgetting to put the airlock on until the next day, all of my brews have developed a metallic taste. I just made a beer that tasted so good pre-carbonation that I entered it in this year's Orange County Fair. I Brewlosophy carbed it at 50 psi for 6 hours, felt it was slightly undercarbed a bit, and bumped it up to 30 psi for a couple more hours. It was a little overcarbed for my palate, and I did get a very slight hint of that metallic taste. It's been in the keg for a week, and each day it's been getting worse. It's to the point that I've scratched my first comp entry and have been lying to my neighbors by telling them that I drank it all. They all think I'm an alky, but since I've only shared my decent beers with them, they think I know what I'm doing. I'll take the latter any day on that one. I'm brewing with 2 10-gallon coolers and a 10-gallon stainless steel kettle. I'm kegging in an aluminum torpedo keg and dispensing in a Kegco faucet. I'm also using a 3-liter aluminum measuring cup. There's metal everywhere. I've eliminated my faucet by bottling with the same side effects. I can't imagine my measuring cup is the problem. It tastes fine pre-carb, and it seems to be the homebrew standard. For better or for worse, I think on that one. It does show some signs of oxidation stains, though. I've complained to my local homebrew store about the aluminum keg, and they swear it can't be the problem. I did find some residual PBW at the bottom one time and thought I nailed it, but rinsed, sniffed, inspected 20 times before my most recent batch, and the taste is still there. I even gave some granules of PBW a little taste. Never know. Could still be it, I thought. In case anyone is wondering, it tastes like ocean water that's covered in a deathly amount of acid. I would not recommend. I use an RV hose and filter and live in Southern California, but I can't imagine the water is causing the problem. What should I eliminate or change first? Could overcarbonation, bad water chemistry, my keg, PBW, star sand, my kettle, or my measuring cup be the problem? Or something else? Thanks for your time. Love the podcast. It makes my 25-mile, 1.5-hour drive in SoCal go by quicker. Okay. So before I got around to reading this email, he actually sent another one clarifying some things from the first one. It's not nearly as long. I have a problem of proofreading after hitting send. Some reasons why I'm having problems eliminating the problem that I didn't clarify. I bottled from the keg. I've managed to overcarb all of my beers by either jacking up the PSI and waiting or doing the shake. My measuring cup is stained since I decided to put some bottle caps and star sand in there for the bottling day. Ray, what do you think, man?
Well, so my first thought right away was like aluminum keg.
Yeah. I don't think torpedo kegs are aluminum. I don't know where he got the idea that it is. I think they only make stainless kegs.
Yeah, I looked that up while you're reading that, and it doesn't specify. It says it has a welded on stainless steel handle. So at that point, you can't weld stainless to aluminum not easily anyway. So
right.
I'm pretty certain that that's a stainless steel keg, because that was my first. While aluminum, by all accounts seems to be okay for like during the boil and things like that, fermented beer is more acidic, and with the addition to carbonic acid and things like that, I don't think that unlined aluminum is a appropriate storage vessel for fermented beer, but I don't think that's what he has.
I don't think it's the package either. The other thing, after we chatted about this a little bit beforehand, the other thing that came to my mind was the Kegco faucets. Those are the chrome-plated brass. I thought maybe if there was some sort of a small scratch and he's serving all of his beers through that, but he says that he served, through picnic taps to eliminate that as a variable, and he's still getting that metallic flavor.
I use, I have five faucets. 3 of them are the chrome-plated Perlix, and pretty much all the chrome is worn off on the inside of those anyway at this point. It looks like bare brass pretty much on the inside, but I couldn't tell you a difference from a pour off of the all stainless faucets I have versus the 3 brass faucets. The one other thing that, I live in Southern California as well. One of the things that we have here is very, very hard water. I'm not sure what his water profile or what his management is, but he mentioned the residue with the PBW. I haven't seen this with PBW, but I haven't used PBW. I use OxyClean generally speaking. But one of the things I've noticed is that if I clean my kegs or anything with OxyClean and I let it sit, it actually builds up like a scale with the hard water on the metal surface that I can only get off, like it's really, really hard to scrub off, that I basically have to chemically remove by doing an acid wash with star sand. The first time I didn't know what it was. I actually used vinegar, and that got it off as well.
And then all your beers tasted acetic after that.
Right.
Sure.
No, it's I rinsed and cleaned afterwards. But, that's one thing I'm thinking is that if he's not kind of like redissolving some of those, because I think it's actually a mineral buildup. I think it's some kind of reaction with the hard water and the basic makeup of like the OxyClean type cleaners.
Yeah. I'm with you. The only thing, if it's not a gear issue, an issue of actually like, aluminum keg or the faucets or anything else like that, and it's only happening after you keg it. I'm not an expert on gases or anything like that, but carbonic acid certainly came to mind. If you are overcarbonating, I tend to get kind of I don't know if I describe it as metallic, but certainly kind of a sharp, not terribly pleasant characteristic from overcarbed beer. But your water, I mean, if you haven't, Robert, if you haven't set your water in for testing and you're using that, and especially if you're adjusting that. So if you're adding more hardness to it, it would make sense to me that you're just picking up some of those metals, and your tongue is perceiving that kind of metallic characteristic. I would try brewing a batch with store-bought RO water. And, I don't even think you need to really adjust it. Just throw a batch together and see if you get that characteristic from a simple pale ale or something like that.
RO just with like a teaspoon per 5 gallons of calcium chloride.
Right.
Is a pretty, useful baseline.
Yeah, I agree.
The other thing to keep in mind, we talk about testing water and things like that. My experience here in Southern California has been that's perhaps not worth it. And the reason I say that is that I've seen the total dissolved solid count on my local water vary up and down, by, factors of like 2 or 3 pretty quickly, like to where within over the course of a couple of weeks, it'll go from 175 parts per million total dissolved solids up over 500.
Wow.
And so I don't know that it makes sense here locally the way our water supply is in Southern California.
It's just too inconsistent.
Yeah,
right?
It's just like you're getting a test and it's really just a snapshot of what it was that day.
Right.
So I'm a big fan of RO and then add minerals as desired.
Right, and you can buy. I mean, we've got everything from the HBrew RO system made specifically for home brewing, or I picked up an RO filter on Amazon. I think it was like $80 with all the parts that you need. So that's what we'd recommend, Robert. Thank you for your feedback. If you have any feedback for the show, you can email it to feedback@brewlosophy.com. Or you can even phone in your feedback. We're getting some fun voicemails over there. You can call us at 951-444-0320. So when I started homebrewing, it was common to avoid making lager beer due to the purported requirement that they be fermented cool. When I realized they weren't any more difficult to brew than the ales I'd been making, I started researching the various styles and quickly learned that lager stood for more than just yellow Pilsner. In fact, the various styles ran the gamut of color and flavor. I'll never forget picking up a Uinta Baba. I think it's called Baba or Baba. There's a black sheep on the front. At the store back in June of 2012, my first ever experience with a Schwarzbier. And knowing I was going to be brewing a bunch of this style after tasting and absolutely loving that beer. Have you had Baba, Ray?
Not that I'm aware of.
Oh, dude, if you see it in the store, Uinta, they're a great brewery out of Utah anyways. But Baba, this was kind of a life-changing beer for me. So I'd heard Schwarzbier described as being basically a Pilsner with a touch of some sort of like dehusked or debittered black malt, which imparts just barely a whisper of that typical characteristics expected from such a dark beer. I always enjoy trying others' versions of Schwarzbier and was excited to review award-winning homebrewer Jake Freshour's version of Schwarzbier with my buddies.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim. Definitely not Coors Light.
Definitely not Coors Light.
I don't know. What do you think, dog?
I don't know.
Smell anything?
I don't smell anything.
But let's taste it together.
I like that.
I like it too. It's some kind of a oatmeal stout something. I don't know. It's good.
Oak barrel taste.
Yeah, I like it. Coffee.
Yeah.
Like cold coffee.
Got something at the end.
Yeah.
I don't know what to describe it as, but it's there.
I want to hear this. Whatever it is, it's good.
Yeah, it is. It's very good.
It's heavy. Wouldn't be able to eat this and a Big Mac. We'd have to just stick to this.
Yeah.
I like it a lot.
That's real good.
Now you're influencing us. Your charisma is overpowering. No, it's really good. I don't know enough to tell you what it is, but it's good. There's a little coffee in there.
I just get that even more at the end after you're done drinking it.
The coffee.
Yeah.
Kind of coffee.
That's
It's
good.
a mocha latte frappuccino. It gets easier to drink the more I drink it too. Like all the flavors kind of
smooth.
go away. It's just, it's just real nice and smooth.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's probably German. Everything's German, right? It doesn't taste like cobblestones. It doesn't taste European-y. No, it's probably German.
It's German. It's a Schwarzbier. It's a Schwarzbier is a basically
Beer made with Schwartz.
I thought I tasted some Schwartz. I wasn't sure.
I
didn't wanna
see
say
your
it to be-
Schwartz is as big as mine.
It's a Schwartz fight.
That's good. Whatever it was.
It is very good.
I will have another. Is there more? What do we give? What do you think? 6.9 Jersey Tims?
I'd probably go a little higher.
Okay, so I'll give it 8 jerseys. How many Tims do you give it?
Eight sounds around.
We'll give it 8
right.
Jersey Tims.
I think it's pretty obvious the color of this beer impacted the guy's perception, at least to some degree. I didn't taste anywhere near the amount of coffee or roast that it sounds like Jersey and Tim did, though there was certainly something present. It was there, but it wasn't strong. It wasn't the thing that I noticed. I really just think that their impression of this kind of coffee characteristic was driven largely by the way it looks, and as we know, that happens. Right?
Yeah, well, and I think it's to a beer drinker who usually drinks lighter beers, certainly in a beer like that, that's going to be what jumps out. That's
Totally.
what stands out as I don't want to say out of place, but that's what is the movement in the bushes, if you will.
Yeah, it was definitely the thing that made it different from what they know to be a lager beer. Well, the fact they both liked it, I thought was pretty telling. They did both enjoy that beer. I absolutely loved it, which is no big surprise considering Jake is one of the best homebrewers in the state of Oregon, who I'm really, really stoked to have brewing our beers for us at HomebrewCon. So thanks so much, Jake. I hope you send me more beer because it was really, really good. If you want your beer or any other fermented beverage that you make to be reviewed on the show, you can email me, marshall@brewlosophy.com, and we will get you all set up. And if you live anywhere near any of us, we'd love to get you involved as a participant. We've got contributors in Chicago, Illinois, Denver, Colorado, Pueblo, Colorado, Corona, California, Atlanta, Georgia, and Fresno, California. You can, again, shoot me an email and I'll connect you with the contributor closest to you. All right, we'll be right back after this short break to discuss everything that is astringency. When dumping wort-soaked grain and leftover low-gravity wort while cleaning up after a brew day, did you ever wonder what your true efficiency would be if that wort made its way to the kettle instead? Using the brew bag, a fabric filter for all mash tuns and brewing methods, allows you to capture every last drop of wort. Not only does this increase kettle efficiency, it lowers your grain bill, which saves you money. Throwing wort in the trash is like dumping a 12-pack down the drain and just doesn't make sense. Use the brew bag and leave no wort behind. I've been using these filters for a long time and recommend them to everyone. I never have to worry about a stuck sparge and cleanup is fast and easy. Go grab yourself a brew bag fabric filter at brewinabag.com and be sure to use code TBP17 at checkout to get a discount on your order.
Compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all grain beer in a single compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high-quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to Grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free recipe creator tool. Once more, head on over to Grainfather.com, that's Grainfather.com, and get started today.
Shopping for brewing supplies online can be a real hassle, which is why we recommend Love to Brew. They've got great prices, super fast shipping, and they carry exclusive products like East Coast Yeast, the Brewers Essentials brand, and their award-winning beer recipe kits. They're also the only place you can pick up your very own Brewlosophy recipe kit. The numbers don't lie. Love to Brew has hundreds of 5-star reviews and thousands of brewers are choosing them for their supplies and ingredients each year. Experience the difference at lovetobrew.com. That's love, the number 2, brew.com. Astringency seems to be one of the more commonly cited off flavors when it comes to beer evaluation. And while we refer to it as an off flavor, like we discussed earlier, I think the more appropriate term would be like off mouthfeel, as it doesn't really have a taste, but rather leads to some curious sensations in the mouth. Before we get into that, though, let's talk a little bit about what exactly astringency is.
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, I think on the BJCP score sheet, I think it is actually listed in the mouthfeel section, not the flavor, flavor perspective of the score sheet. Not that that's the end all be all of what it is, but it's that drying, mouth puckering, coats the cheeks of your mouth almost feeling, most commonly associated with tannins. With these are tannins are acidic compounds that come from plant matter. Wood, commonly we talk about like tannins in woodworking will leach through certain types of paints and finishes and things like that over time. So it's a plant-based, generally product.
Yeah. Right. And as far as I know, I think the two most common sources of these tannins, which, I think if I'm not mistaken, tannins are really just phenols that come from, at least in the brewing process, mostly like grain husks and hop stems. So, when inside that hop cone, when they break it down, there's little bits of that stem, they get kind of ground up with it. And then through the brewing process, they polymerize to polyphenols such as tannins that apparently lead to this perceptible level of astringency.
Yeah, I think that's right. And when you think about like the two parts of beer that are closest to things like wood, it is the husks of the grain, and any stem or non-flower cone material from the hops.
Right. Yeah, and like you mentioned, astringency is this term that we use to describe almost more a kind of an experience in the mouth as opposed to necessarily just a flavor or an aroma. This astringency causing chemicals basically restrict body tissue. And that's why people will describe it as kind of like a puckering feeling, but it's not necessarily the same type of puckering that you get when you have something that's sour or bitter. It's really more of a contraction in your mouth. People describe it as being fuzzy, which I think is a funny one. So like kind of like a cat's tongue, and a cat licks you. I've heard it described as that. I personally, the places where I feel like I've experienced astringency are when I'm drinking red wine or I'm having a really strong black tea. I don't really perceive it as much when I'm drinking a green tea or something like that. And for me, the experience is almost like if you kind of touch the back of your jaw right under your ear, I get this tightness there. And to me, that's what I've always associated with astringency. Whether I'm right or wrong, I'm not totally sure.
Yeah, I think for me, black tea, particularly over-extracted black tea. So black tea that's been steeped too long, or by some argument too long, I guess. But it's been steeped longer, or with more water passing through it. Much like over-extracting a sparge, which I'm sure we'll talk about later here. But that it seems to come out after, or in greater concentration after the other flavor compounds of the more delicate flavor compounds of a nice tea. And I experience it more, you mentioned that roughness or fuzziness, more like for me, it's more like the linings of my cheeks and things like that feel drier, like they're no longer sort of lubricated.
Yeah. It's funny that you mentioned the word dry, because I remember when I first started getting into craft beer, like 18 years ago, whatever it was, when I would hear the term dry, what I would relate that to, or what I thought people were referring to, wasn't just that a beer had had a low finishing gravity in essence, but that it produced that feeling in your mouth. And it makes me wonder if in my, search for a dry beer back then, if I wasn't really searching for something that maybe had a little bit more astringency in it.
Yeah. I mean, I know I've made similar confusions perhaps where, I think even, before I brewed or anything like that, when somebody would talk about a wine being dry, when they would say it was dry and I would taste it, I don't know anything about wine still, but I would perceive that as that tannic bite. Whereas, really when we're talking about dryness in beer or wine or anything like that, we're talking about a lack of the sweetness, which really isn't the same thing at all. But because that sensation of the tannin, of the astringency does have that drying sort of mouth pucker character.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the impression that a truly dry beer leaves, again, and it's the same thing, people confusing astringency with bitterness, I think a dry beer, it kind of accentuates that quick off the palate. It kind of rinses your palate clean really quickly, at least in my experience. I could see how that might get confused with astringency. What's a little bit, I'm hesitant to say funny but I do think on some level it's kind of humorous that astringency is so commonly called out, relative to other off flavors, I should say, in beer evaluation, when it seems almost like it's this for a lot of people that I talk to about it, they're either, oh yeah, I totally know what it's like. Well, I've very rarely tasted a beer where I've noticed astringency in it. And I wonder if people aren't confusing it with something else, whether that's, people will say that astringency is caused by overhopping, or especially like overhopping, adding a huge dry hop charge. I get something else from that, but I've never experienced it as astringency as I know astringency to be.
Yeah. I mean, my experience of astringency and tannin characteristic is not well rooted in beer and brewing. It's, that's something that I've experienced in other areas, like we talked about tea and such. Right. And while I'm quite hesitant to ever suggest, people are by and large confused or wrong and I'm right, the astringency is a bit more of a nebulous type of experience that I'm not sure I have a really great reference point for with regards to beer, unless we're talking about something that's on a much lower kind of threshold. We'll talk about some of the experiments and stuff and some beers that I've brewed, over the years where, it may have been astringency, but I could also be convinced that it was something else,
something else.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's where I'm at as well. Well, there are particularly, I think it's good to kind of root this in the brewing thing, because I do feel like I have perceived astringency in these other realms, but in beer, I'm kind of lost. I'm not sure if I have or not. I've thought that I have. Like I said before, I've certainly, docked points on, and I'll admit it, on a beer that I thought was astringent, though it wasn't like I was totally dead set on it being astringent. It could have just been overly bitter for me. But there are various methods that brewers have developed to avoid astringency. And one of those involves maintaining a proper mash pH, or a mash pH that's within the general range, right? So like between 5.2 and 5.6 is kind of the safe zone. My understanding is that, and I was just reading something about this weekend, in fact, is that most mashes, regardless of what the ingredients are that you're throwing in there, will tend over time to settle in that range. It's kind of like where they want to be. But there are certain scenarios, perhaps super, super alkaline water, or if you accidentally bump in maybe a little bit too much pickling lime, where that mash pH can get way up there. And that is said to extract those tannins from the grain husks. I'm not so sure many people are actually experiencing that issue, at least regularly in their brewing.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those ones where, I think we've seen the beliefs around astringency or tannins, and I'm using those interchangeably. because I think in brewing we're broadly talking about tannin-based astringency. There may be other ways to get that, to get that experience of astringency, but I think generally speaking, brewing literature and whatnot is speaking more specifically about tannin. Tannin, but I think I've seen even in my time brewing a bit of an evolution in that regard, to where, when I started brewing, it was, over extracting a mash. Then, we talked, when brewing the bag started getting more and more popular, there was a lot of, a lot of talk about, really fine, grinding grain too fine, over crushing the grain could result in more, more tannin. Running a sparge too long, is
that was one of the bigger ones that I remember back before I converted to all grain was, one of the biggest risks is if you over sparge, because as you're rinsing off all of those sugars, those grains are like, fine, we'll give you something, and then giving up tannins, which, impart this kind of, it increases the pH basically of that mixture. It's no longer really the mash, but you're running that water through this higher pH, and again, you're extracting those tannins from that as well.
Well, and much like my experience, like with black tea, it's like that you get the other flavors seemingly first or in greater proportion first, but perhaps perhaps there is something to the idea that the proportion of what's coming out later that is tannins is greater than the proportion of what's being extracted early on. I mean, that doesn't seem crazy. The other one I've seen, we've seen talked about, I think quite a lot, is sparge water that's too hot. And this has been, commonly cited as 170 degrees being sort of like that ideal top end, mash temperature or sparge temperature. And I suspect, as with most things, if there is an effect there, it's not a threshold effect where there's no tannins up to a point, and then all of a sudden all the tannins come out at, at 171. But there may be some type of an effect where, it crosses over a line and becomes more prevalent, or on that sliding scale just gets to where you're getting too much of the undesirable.
Yeah, that point where you start to hear Yanni instead of Laurel, basically. Let's see. Up until maybe, I think brewing a bag really did kind of change the way people view astringency. That's just kind of a personal, observation, opinion. But I remember 4 or 5 years ago, it was like, you do not, sparge or mash anywhere above 170 degrees. In fact, you should do it lower than that. Keep it at 168, and then as brewing a bag came around, and people were doing these kind of different wonky things, it seemed like the focus shifted much more away from the temperature thing and onto the mash pH issue. And now you got all of us. I'm a part of this group who are acidifying our mash water, acidifying our sparge water, making sure to keep that pH in that proper range. And I still monitor my mash, all my temperatures as well. But I just wonder to what extent, maybe there's some sort of like a combined effect,
Yeah, well, and there's also the which maybe we should touch on as well. But there's also the don't squeeze the grain bag, right? That the tannins are in there, and unless you squeeze them, they'll stay in the grain husks.
Yeah, they're like a sponge, and you're squeezing. You're strong enough to actually squeeze out the tannins from the grain husks.
Right, and I think over the years here we've seen some pushback on those ideas, and certainly in listening to people like John Palmer and such, they've attributed a lot more of potential tannins with, with pH, temperature, that sort of thing, and been fairly dismissive of the idea that there's like a physical opportunity from whether it's squeezing or over grinding, something like that. That they're like John Palmer, for example, is quite insistent. I think if you listen to him, that it's a chemical reaction that would extract it, not a physical or mechanical one.
Right. No, and I think for the most part, we recently did our show on brew in a bag and discussed that experiment as well. I think for the most part, there's a lot of anecdotal reports out there, at the very least, kind of supporting that notion. If you are a fly sparge brewer, there is a way, besides acidifying your sparge water, I think it's pretty common. One way to avoid over sparging and any potential tannin extraction caused by that is to cut off your sparge no lower than about 1 degree Plato. So when you've got, when the wort that you're extracting from your mash at that point is about 1004, no lower than that, I've heard is a good kind of fail safe.
Which I can't frankly imagine why you
would ever sparge that low, right?
Well, why a brewer? I mean, other than to just get a higher number from an efficiency standpoint or something like that, just for the sake of a higher number.
Me either, man.
You're just going to end up with more wort that's more dilute. I don't.
And probably more wort than you need. I mean, if you're going that low.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyways, that is one option. The other, another commonly cited, source of astringency at beer is when, you're mashing and you maybe snag your bag and rip a little hole in it if you're doing brew in a bag, or you're just kind of lazy and you end up with some grain husks in your wort.
I think that's I think that probably is some variation of the same idea of it being getting too hot, right? The idea that those grains would contain that tannin and that would be fine right up until the point that it got over that, like I say, 170 degree or whatever you decide is your threshold temperature. Right. But boiling it certainly would help to extract anything that remains. And again, this is something we see with tea as well, is that a lot of tea is said to be made better with water that's, maybe 200 degrees instead of right off boil or something like that.
Right. Yeah. I have to believe that this is purely based on the whole temperature thing and the amount of time that grain husk is in contact with the wort as well. What's interesting to me is that during the boil, and we've actually demonstrated this numerous times, but during the boil, pH from the mash point, it actually kind of seems to reduce a little bit. So it goes down. So you're kind of at the same time that you are purportedly at least increasing the risk of astringency in your beer, you're also kind of helping it, even if some grains do make it over in this scenario, because that pH is going to drop just a hair, and kind of balance out at that kind of a typical level. This is making me think of an experience. I think it was my very first all grain batch. I'm surprised this only just came to my mind. I wasn't quite sure what I was doing. This was a long time ago. And I brewed an IPA and we mashed it like normal for an hour and we ran off the first runnings, that sweet wort. And then we added the sparge volume of water, but we left that sparge water in there for another hour, not thinking that it was just a rinse, And we collected that. Everything was good after that. And we boiled the beer and added the normal amount of hops. And this beer, I'm telling you, we just called it super bitter, but I can't help but wonder if maybe it wasn't some sort of tannin extraction from being in contact, one potentially, higher pH wort in that second, I guess you would call it a second mash really. But then also just that longer hot contact contact with the hot water.
Yeah, I don't know that you'll ever be able to go back in time and try and suss out what was what there.
If Doc Brown has anything to say about it, I will. But the final kind of thing that I have written in my notes about astringency has to do with contamination. Now, I'm sort of I think contamination causes 99% of the problems in beer. I think you can throw together a really shitty recipe and still produce a drinkable beer. I think, you can mess up your mash, you can mess up all of these things, but beer kind of wants to be beer. You know what I mean? The one thing that will always, in my opinion, unless it's intentional, will always screw up a beer is a contamination. And I have read that certain types of bacteria and I think some wild yeast will produce this very tannic-like astringent characteristic, and that's one way. You might misperceive that as or at least mistake it for something that had to do with the grains or the mash or whatever. But it could be a contaminant. Have you ever heard anything like that?
I mean, this is where I sometimes do question: are we talking about contamination Are we talking about, phenols from contamination versus
Right.
actual tannins and, acidity or and astringency? What are we actually dealing with? The other thing, though, I think that's worth considering with, whether it's a particularly yeast strain or a wild yeast infection, something. One of the things that, both yeast in suspension and wild contamination tends to do is keep stuff in suspension. So one of the things that if it's tannins in the beer, for example, they may be there, but if there's something else that's keeping them afloat, if you will, and delivering them to the palate,
Right.
It may be a secondary effect
Yeah.
where it's
That's a
magnifying
good
something else that was there all along, but didn't get to settle out like it might have in a properly fermented clean beer or something like that.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree. And I, I've had beers that just the yeast has failed to drop out, beers and cider, in fact, and I get kind of a sharp characteristic. It is more flavor based. That is just very unpleasant, and that beer doesn't taste right until it drops out. So I could see how if it's clinging on to those astringency causing tannins or whatever it is, then it's just going to amplify that experience. Well, for the person who wants to experience the beauty that is astringency, let's talk about a few ways that they can kind of produce this experience on their own. We've been talking about the whole tea bag thing. Some people will say take like a whole tea bag and put it in your cheek, like put it up next to your cheek and just kind of hold it there with your tongue, I imagine. My recommendation, that doesn't sound very pleasant to me, is to make a glass of tea, but then take that tea bag and squeeze the living hell out of it and collect that squeezed portion and see if you don't get some sort of an experience when you do that. Now, this is something I've done numerous times just for the sake of experiencing this astringent character. You have any other ideas, Ray?
No, that was really similar to what I was going to suggest, actually, which is take a tea and make a cup of nice tea first with that tea bag, and steep it just for a minute or two, and then pull that tea bag out and add it into a fresh dose of like near boiling water, and maybe, like you say, give it a little squeeze or something, but try and get that sort of second extraction out of the tea bag, and I think you'll find that the tannic experience or the astringency is quite a bit more prominent.
I think so too. There are other ways you can do it. Well, I think probably the way to know that you're actually experiencing astringency is to buy a flavor standard. You got places like Flavor Active, I believe. Well, there are multiple different sources. I forget what the brand names are, but they offer astringency flavor standards, which means you are dosing. You can go out and buy yourself like a Miller Lite and dose that with to a certain degree, and then taste that and compare it to a clean version of that same beer and see what that experience is like for you to really hone your ability to recognize astringency. Another way is to drink red wine. Red wine is known for its astringency, and I think to some degree it's a desirable, or at least a kind of a sought after component of a lot of red wines.
I won't propose to know much about wine. I do think it is astringency is considered a characteristic of specifically fairly young red wines, which would lend itself to the idea that there may be a bit of a suspension effect too. An older wine would have been more settled.
Yeah. Another way that I've heard, there's just a couple more here, is to take grapes and then when you're done eating the grape, or if you want to kind of scrape the skin off of the grape, you want to keep those skins in your mouth and just kind of chomp on them and leave them kind of next to your cheek, in between your kind of cheek and your teeth. And you can, I've heard that you can, and it doesn't matter what color the grape is, though I think, darker versions work a little bit better for this. Finally, I'm almost certain they sell liquid tannin out there for dosing things like cider or wine if it doesn't have what you're looking for, because to some level, all beers have tannin in it. But on some level, or if you want to get a certain sharpness in your wine or your cider or your beer, you can add just minute amounts of this and dose it until it has that brightness and that sharpness that doesn't necessarily get experienced like the fuzzy thing or that kind of tensing of the muscles in your mouth.
Yeah, that's a great option too, and I didn't think of it, but more beer sells a half a dozen different varieties of liquid or powdered tannin.
Right. So you could just take your own homebrew and add a whole bunch of tannin to it, and then submit that in a competition and see if people notice it. That sounds like something I'd do. Curious how blind participants would perceive beers made using methods intended to increase astringency. We put it to the test, and we will be discussing those experiments and the results that came from them right after these messages from our sponsors. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer, and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD. That's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. Founded in 1978 by brewing pioneer Charlie Papazian, the American Homebrewers Association is a division of the Brewers Association focused specifically on protecting and promoting the hobby of homebrewing. In addition to their work lobbying for the rights of homebrewers across the country, they're also the primary sponsor of Brewlosophy.com. By joining the AHA, not only are you supporting their cause, but you get a ton of benefits as well. Discounts at breweries across the U.S., early access to tickets for events like the Great American Beer Festival, and you get to attend HomebrewCon, the world's biggest gathering of homebrewers. Head over to Brewlosophy.com/AHA now to sign up to become a member. As we discussed, a popularly held belief as to where astringency in beer comes from has to do with grain husk making its way into the boil, where tannins are extracted and thus contribute the undesirable mouth-puckering characteristic that we call astringency. One method said to reduce the risk of grain ending up in the wort is the Vorlauf, which apparently is German for recirculation, though when I used Google Translate, it tells me that it means liter. Either way, Ray, you designed a pretty wild experiment to test the merits of this method.
Yeah, this was kind of fun. I wanted to test, not Vorlauf specifically, but what if you did just like the worst possible job of Vorlaufing? So I made one big wort and Vorlaufed it normally. And then I kind of measured tried to measure some of the wort as it passed through a filter to try and get an idea of how much grain would pass through just a normal Vorlauf procedure on the first runnings. And then I added about like 20 times that amount. Just basically added a half a pound of spent grain from the mash into the boil of one of the two kettles.
Or the very precise measuring method, also known as a full red Solo cup,
yes.
right?
Yeah. One full scoop of a Solo cup.
There you go. Yeah.
But yeah, like it was about 7 or 8 ounces, I think, of damp but drained grain material, just added right to the boil, to simulate the idea of whether it's a broken Brunebag bag or just a bad Vorlauf or not doing one at all, and just letting the plugged filter or whatever just clear itself out right into your boil kettle.
Right. So just to clarify a little bit, this was a single batch of wort that you split between two kettles and then tossed in a whole, solo cup full of grains into one of them.
That's right. It was basically a single 10-gallon batch that went into a single kettle. I stirred it all up to kind of homogenize it to make sure there was no stratification or anything in there, and then I used the magical power of gravity to link two kettles side by side and allow them to equalize with a siphon. And
now, I was reading through this experiment the other day in preparation for this show, and I completely forgot about this bit. But when you boiled both of those worts, they ended up looking pretty different, right?
Like the one looked pretty exactly normal. The other one looked like pretty gross. Looked a little looked more like, say, making chicken stock. With like a big,
just some film atop like kind of like a sticky almost skin on the top of the boil.
Yeah, film would be putting it pretty mildly. It was more like a raft. It was pretty gross. And eventually that did kind of break up and and rejoin the rest of the wort, I guess. But I was reading up on astringency, and one of the big places where it said that you find that is after fermentation, the Kreuzen ring. You don't want that going back into your beer. I wonder, maybe this raft getting combined in that wort would have some sort of an impact. After the boil, were there any differences in the gravities or anything like that? Gravities were kind of right on the money. They both fermented out right about the same. They had really, really similar appearances. They were both fine with gelatin. So, any suspension effects, like I was kind of talking about before, would have been probably hypothetically neutralized.
Right.
With the gelatin, because it did strip both of them bright.
Yeah, those beers look beautiful.
Yeah. No, they came out both quite bright. So.
Yeah. All right. So identical OG, identical FG. I think they went from 1046 to 1011. Both of them were exactly the same. Cold crashed, fine with gelatin, kegged them up, carbonated them, and served them to 23 tasters at a Beer Me Beer Club. Looks like meeting. Yeah,
and we came just basically one participant short of reaching significance. I will also say I also sent a couple bottles of this beer to the fine gentleman at Basic Brewing Radio. I think that was April 7th, 2016 was the episode that we discussed this on there as well. So if you want to hear a little bit more about this experiment in particular, you can check that out.
Those guys were included in the participant pool, if I remember correctly. And so of those 23, you said we came one short. We needed 12 in order to say that it was significant, but only 11 people were able to identify the unique sample. And I believe the unique sample was the we'll call it the astringency beer, the one with all the grains in it.
That's right. Yeah. The one thing that that was weird about this, or maybe not weird, was that early on, a couple of weeks before I actually started the triangle tests, it was completely obvious and blatant which one was which. And the boiled grain beer was, quite frankly, completely unpleasant.
That's an experience. I feel like nobody's drinking beer fresh out of if you are, more power to you, but we're conditioning these beers for a little while. And in that time, stuff happens,
Yeah. And I'm not even willing to sit here and say that one was astringent. Even at all of that, it was different. It had a tangy kind of weirdness to it that maybe was astringent, but I don't recall ever feeling that dry mouth kind of sensation that I get from over extracted black tea or anything like that.
Yeah. Just different, though.
and pretty uniformly unpleasantly different. Probably more so than many other beers where I've, at one point or another tasted a slight difference. This was pretty unpleasant.
Yeah, I bet it was. I was pretty surprised. For me on this one, it was almost like you got grain. You're doing something so drastically different that it seemed. I expected to see a higher OG. I'll be honest, in the one that had grains added, because I just thought a whole cup of grain. Maybe you're going to extract maybe a little bit more sugar, but that wasn't the case. And then in the end, not even. 12 out of 23 people were able to distinguish the unique sample. It was pretty interesting to me.
Yeah. And by the end of the tasting panels and stuff, I, blind, I could still pick out something, I thought. But it was dramatically less than what I had experienced early on. And, both beers at that point were quite pleasant. Any unpleasantness was gone. Whether there was a preference or whatever at that point, I don't really have one. And I was pretty trained, I think, at that point on how to get whatever remnant of that character might have been.
Yeah, and I think those results in general, just kind of like you mentioned, they lead me to think that maybe there was something. Gelatin finding, as we know, kind of speeds up the conditioning process. But it makes me wonder, I'm almost certain I've read somewhere that astringency will drop out. Those tannins will eventually drop out. And so I just wonder if maybe that was the reason they from your perception, they came a little bit closer together. Well, another commonly cited source of astringency is mash pH, as we discussed earlier, namely that when it gets above about 5.6 pH, tannins can be extracted from the grain husks. I tested this out by brewing 2 separate 5-gallon batches of IPA, one of which I adjusted to have a pH of 5.2, which is pretty normal for me, while the other was adjusted to be an unrealistically high 6.4 pH. That's crazy high. Let's put it that way. I don't think anybody in real life is ever going to accidentally have, a mash of 6.4 pH. To do this, I used a pretty decent amount of pickling lime, which is also known as calcium hydroxide. It smells, when that dust kind of wafts into the air, it kind of smells like bleach. So be careful with this stuff if you plan to use it. Apparently, people who are using a lot of, let's say, roasted barley or black malt, you can just literally just sprinkle this stuff in to bring up your mash pH so it doesn't get too low. Besides the addition of the calcium hydroxide, both batches were treated exactly the same, and surprising to me, ended up with the same 1059 OG. Single large starter was evenly split between the worts once they were racked into their fermentation vessels. Fermentation took off at the same time, looked exactly the same between the two beers. The only real difference I noticed was during the boil. The high pH beer actually had one of the clumpier hot breaks that I've seen in a long time. I did take hydrometer measurements showing that the 5.4 mash pH beer finished at 1013 Fg, whereas the high mash pH beer finished at 1012. I'm not sure if that was a function of the variable or not, but it didn't seem too crazy to me.
Well, that doesn't, because we do know from the literature and such that different mash pHs are different. The idea is that there's differences both in flavor, but also in performance. Both right. in the performance of the mash or the extraction of the mash. So, to me, I'm inclined to suspect that that's that in one of those beers you created an environment that was more favorable for one enzyme versus the other.
Potentially. Absolutely. So that may very well be it, but would it have an impact on a level of astringency? That was what I was curious about. The beers were both cold crashed. They were both fined with gelatin. I kegged them up and burst carbonated them. I think I let them condition for about a week before I collected data on these. The first thing that I noticed before even sampling these beers was that the high mash pH beer was ever so slightly hazier than the standard mash pH sample, which was crystal clear. It looked commercial bright. But the high mash pH one just had a lingering, it wasn't very strong, but just kind of a lingering haze, which I kind of presumed were tannins that were going to be perceptible to people. So I served these beers to 20 participants, which would require 11 to get it right in order for us to say that it was significant. And in the end, only 8 people accurately identified the odd beer out. Again, it kind of corroborates what, your experience was on that first experiment, that even if there is tannin or astringency causing compounds in these beers, people aren't necessarily picking it out as much as I would have thought that they might have.
Yeah. I mean, I think to critique ourselves a little bit here, I think the one thing that, we may be doing, with finding these is stripping out some of that material that's in suspension, which heck, maybe gelatin findings or something like that is a reasonable insurance policy against.
I'd call it a solution, not a problem.
Yeah. I mean, might be a reasonable insurance policy against astringency if in fact there was something there that was not. But I think the thing that was maybe most interesting to me about this, and this isn't specifically about the astringency question, but how the pH of these beers migrated to each other.
Yeah,
you started massively different, or an order of magnitude different in terms of your acidity.
Yeah.
At the mash, even by the time the boil was done, the gap had closed substantially to where they were basically 0.6, 5.16 versus 5.73. And by the time they were done, they were a tenth of a point apart.
Yeah. Yeah, it was crazy. For anyone who's interested in the whole impact of mash pH, we've got a whole episode on that as well. You can go back and listen to that one. My perception of these beers, I was convinced beforehand, first off, that they were going to be different only because of the high amount of pickling lime that I use. To me, that is an ingredient. And when we use ingredients, we kind of expect them to impart some sort of noticeable, flavor or aroma or whatever it might be. In this case, I did expect it to kind of have like a bleachy smell or a bleachy aroma or something. And I'll be honest, at the end of the boil, it took everything in me to taste, the refractometer sample, just a drop of it on my tongue because of how strong that stuff smells. So I was a little bit wary, but lo and behold, out of 5 blind triangle attempts that I attempted, when the beers were finished, I only guessed right twice. So 2 out of 5, those were total guesses. I will admit it. So the beers in my mind, they were completely identical, tasted the same. Perhaps more than a lot of recent experiments that I've done. This one really, really did kind of surprise me. When that mash pH is above about 5.6, at least in the past, I start to worry about extracting, tannins and making an astringent beer. And that just was not the case with these beers. They were totally fine.
Yeah, I think this was, very interesting from the astringency perspective because mash pH has been, quite frankly, held out as one of the most likely candidates, even as, anecdotes and to some degree data have shifted the expectation away from things like squeezing grain bags or grinding too fine, that sort of thing. Yeah. The temperature and mash pH have been, heralded as the remaining, main cause.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree. And, one of the things that I thought on this one was, well, it was no sparge. Perhaps it's the rinsing effect of sparging that's the key to extracting tannins. Though it's also possible that what many think they're perceiving as tannins or as astringency, that it's just something else, which, if that's the case, it calls into question our ability to perceive astringency. And that's exactly what Malcolm tested out in one of our off-flavor series experiments, which we'll get to right after I tell you about Brewers Hardware, who specialize in tri-clover compatible sanitary fittings, conical fermenters, kettles, and brew stands. Brewers Hardware offers a variety of unique and hard-to-find items for both the home and craft brewing markets, including high-quality stainless fittings at competitive prices and very fast shipping. They're excited to announce the release of the BCS 482 control system, which provides everything needed to fully automate your brewery. Learn more about this and all of the other great stuff they offer at brewershardware.com. And don't forget to mention Brewlosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. That's brewershardware.com. All right, so we partnered with Flavor Active. They're a maker, one of the bigger that I could find sources of these flavor compounds that you can use to dose your beer. And theirs come in a little capsule, little pill form. They allow beer drinkers basically to dose in different amounts beer so that they can, again, experience these off flavors that they want to learn so much about. And, we like to think that they allow us to kind of hone our noticing skills. But so for this one, contributor Malcolm Fraser used a 50-50 blend of Miller High Life and Miller Lite. Apparently that's something that's common in the commercial beer sensory analysis arena, which I think is pretty cool. He took that blend, he split it 3 ways, and he dosed one of those with the astringent flavor standard from Flavor Active at the recommended dosage, which I'm almost certain, I could not find it on their new website, but I'm almost certain that imparts 6 times the amount of astringency as the non-dosed samples.
Oh, it seems a little bit weird to me. I wonder if it's perhaps 6 times the flavor threshold of what's considered a lower limit for detecting that compound.
You know what? Now that I think about it, I think you're right. 6 times something that you're unaware of how much is actually in there. But so 6 times the amount of the flavor threshold that they've determined, I'm sure, on some level. But regardless, it should be very noticeable to people. And so what we do with this off flavor series is we serve these beers. Usually they're really, pallid commercial beers that don't have very much flavor. And then we dose one of them and then do our regular triangle test. In this one, Malcolm served it to the beers to 19 participants, which would require 11 to identify the odd beer out in order for us to say that people were capable of reliably distinguishing the unique sample from the other ones. And in this one, despite the fact that the beer was dosed with actual astringent powder, only 6 people were capable of identifying the right beer, which really just means they probably guessed, because that's almost right smack on 1/3 of the participants.
Yeah, I am not a mathematician, but I do believe 6 out of 19 is quite close to chance odds.
Yeah, so the tasters just could not distinguish the odd beer out, which I thought was fascinating. So Malcolm went ahead and asked participants to select. The way we do this survey is we even if it's not significant, we ask the participants to select the off flavor that they thought the beer was dosed with, right? And in this one, maybe to no surprise, I guess at this point, but not a single person identified astringency as being the off flavor, so which again, just kind of gives more to this, supports this notion that we are not very good at identifying this characteristic in beer. So it seems.
Yeah. I think this is one of the most interesting aspects of what he did when you compare it to, I think, the score sheet experience that a lot of brewers have had when they send beer off to competition, because it does seem like astringency comes back pretty frequently. Yeah. Certainly probably even more so than, say, chlorophenol or metallic. Which are probably more common and perhaps even easier to, chlorophenol, as far as we know at least, is fairly easy to detect, Right. And again, just because I'm so personally unsure when I've, tasted beers and thought maybe I perceived astringency versus like phenolic off flavor, I'm inclined to think that it's often misidentified.
Yeah. I'm not going to shy away from, my opinion here that I think a good majority at this point of, evaluations of astringent beer are probably just wrong. We're trying all these things that these judges will mark on their score sheets. You got to, don't oversparge, don't do this, don't do that. And we're just not able to produce a a genuinely or an identifiably astringent beer. I think it's pretty interesting. Malcolm did say that he would now, Malcolm is a very, very, he knew what was going on here. He wasn't totally aware of what the off flavor was, but he knew that, what I'd sent him. And so he was looking really hard. He did say he experienced a slight fuzzy prickly sensation in his mouth that helped him to determine that it was probably astringency that I sent him. But yeah, the tasters, not even a full 1/3 were able to identify the odd beer out. So what does all of this mean? When we look at all of these experiments together, what does it say to you?
At risk of making it sound like the last 45 minutes has been a complete waste of time, it puts me kind of back where I started, which is really unsure of my own experience as to what, if anything, I've ever experienced as astringency or tannin in beer. I think it sometimes just gets labeled astringent when you have a beer that's just sort of like unpleasant to have in your mouth. Which I've certainly experienced from, you get a hoppy, like an IPA or a pale ale or something like that that's got a phenolic producing contamination. It's both very bitter and then has that phenol, and it's really unpleasant. But I'm not sure that it's astringent.
Yeah. No, I'm in the same place you are. I think for me, thinking about all of these experiments together, one thing that comes to mind is it's entirely possible, that the beers from the first two experiments, that all four of those did have, a certain level of astringency in them. But that we're just, our threshold for detecting that, or I say I'm sure there are people out there with sensitivities to it. And I don't want to tear down our super tasters and whatnot, but that our ability to detect astringency in beer is just not as good as we've been led to believe, and I'm not saying that to be offensive. I do think at the very least for me, like you, I question when I think I'm tasting something, whether that's diacetyl or DMS, I think to be able to approach my evaluation with a little bit more equivocalness and less certainty, less pride, perhaps. I think that might make for more, in general, this is so opiniony, but I think that makes for better beer judging and better beer evaluation, because if I'm reading an evaluation and somebody says, well, I think I perceived, what is astringency, and these are some issues, as opposed to it is astringency. Well, now, if I feel like it is, and I'm putting all my faith in this judge, which a lot of people do, there's a huge authority thing there. Then those people are just going to focus on these things that they may not need to, as opposed to tackling other issues. It could just be that you over-bittered a beer, something like that. So for me, I'm still going to keep grain out of my boil kettle. I'm still going to mash between 5.2 and 5.6. I'm generally going to, engage in all the practices to avoid astringency in beer. But in those instances where I notice a couple of grains floating in my boiling wort, or I run out of lactic acid to adjust my mash pH, I'm not going to worry nearly as much as I used to. That's for sure.
Yeah, I agree. When I think about what I perceived in, say, the Vorlov experiment, but also in the brew in a bag versus other, where I did perceive a difference, at least at certain times. In the Vorlov one, it was really obvious early on. There was something there. For me, it does not align with the literature on what astringency or tannin is defined as. It was described as. Like I did not perceive that puckering character. I did not perceive that fuzzy mouth. I did not perceive that teabag type characteristic.
Right. No. Yep. Yeah, I think it's interesting, and I look forward to doing more of these shows. I want to thank our patrons actually for the idea to do this show. We put the call out about a week and a half ago or so. What do you guys want to hear us talk about? And it seemed the most popular
idea was to do kind of, focus on off flavors and the experiments that we've done around those. So thanks to our patrons. Again, you can become a patron by going over to patreon.com/brewlosophy to read more about these experiments, all the ones we discussed in this episode, as well as all of the other stuff that we're up to. You can head over to brewlosophy.com.
The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more. Life is good, the likelihood of me.
Looking for a new career? Welcome to Do HVAC Training Service Center in North Charleston. Enroll today in our comprehensive HVAC training hands-on field experience-based program, covering troubleshooting, maintenance, installation, and more on various HVAC systems and ductwork. We offer EPA and NAEP preparation and testing, along with various certifications. Enjoy payment options. Achieve certification in under 5 months. Enroll now for your new journey of skill development and career advancement. Log on to dewhvactrainingsc.com to inquire.